The boy should have drowned. The river was merciless, and the wild had no reason to care. But when the flood roared and silence fell, something unthinkable happened. A mother grizzly stood between a dying current and a boy she'd never seen. No growl, no panic, just presence, just choice. What if the wild wasn't always wild? By the way, where in the world are you watching this from? Let us know below. The sky above Bozeman, Montana was the color of hammered pewter, flat heavy and without promise. Autumn had settled in, painting the town's trees in hues of burnt orange and ochre. A cold wind skimmed over the rooftops, carrying with it the bitter hint of snow from the Gallatin Mountains to the south. It was the kind of morning that made hot coffee a necessity and silence feel sharp. Ethan Riley sat in the back seat of the family's aging Subaru, his knees pulled up against his chest, fingers tracing shapes in the condensation on the window. He was 10 small for his age, with a narrow face and tousled hair that never quite stayed brushed. He had a light smattering of freckles across his nose and a thoughtful way of moving, like he was always calculating some secret plan. His quietness wasn't shyness. It was observance the way a fox watches before it pounces. This camping trip had been his idea, or at least he had begged enough times until his parents agreed. The woods fascinated him, the mystery, the quiet, the possibility that something magical lived just beyond the next rise. In the front passenger seat, his mother Sarah, Riley sipped slowly from a travel mug. Her profile, reflected faintly in the glass, was worn thinner by years that had demanded too much. Once vibrant and quick to laugh, Sarah now carried herself with a gentleness that bordered on fragility. At 35, her figure was long-limbed and wiry, dressed today in hiking boots, fitted cargo pants, and a navy fleece. 2 years ago, she had cradled Ethan's baby sister as her tiny heart faded out. Since then, Sarah smiled less and checked Ethan's temperature twice for even a sniffle. Driving Mike, Riley gripped the wheel a little tighter than necessary. He was a broad man with a barrel chest and sun-weathered skin. His face bore the look of a man who used to talk too loud and joke too often, but lately found himself quieter. He was a mechanic by trade, problem solver by instinct, and had never learned how to fix things that broke on the inside. He'd suggested this trip as a reset, a short overnight hike to Bitterroot Canyon, some marshmallows, and maybe a new memory to help dull the old ones. By late morning, the trailhead welcomed them with a damp breeze and the creaking of trees. Towering pines and firs lined the path, and the family hiked under their canopy, following the curling spine of Trail 6. Ethan darted ahead, his backpack bouncing behind him like a second heartbeat. "I think I just saw a fox," he called, pointing toward a stand of underbrush. Sarah smiled, but didn't chase. "Don't wander too far ahead, please." Mike checked his watch. "We've got about 3 hours until this storm really hits." They continued up the ridge. Leaves clung to their boots. The woods smelled of cedar-wet soil and that crisp scent that always came before a downpour. Birdsong thinned as the clouds thickened overhead. Near the overlook, they paused for a snack. Ethan crouched to investigate mushrooms growing from the base of a log, while Sarah rummaged through her pack for trail mix. That's when it happened. A blur of movement, a tiny squirrel, silver gray and jittery, burst from the underbrush. Its tail arched high like a question mark as it darted toward the trees. Ethan, eyes wide, sprang up. "Wait!" he cried, and gave chase without thinking. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. Mike Rose cursed under his breath and took off after him, but the boy was already gone, swallowed by trees and instinct. Ethan crashed through low branches, laughter bubbling out of his throat. He didn't notice the trail disappearing behind him. The squirrel scurried up a boulder and vanished, but Ethan kept running. He was in a thicket now, tangled roots and hidden slopes. Then, thunder. It rolled through the canyon like the growl of something ancient. Ethan stopped short. The first cold drop hit his forehead. Then another. The sky cracked open. Rain came in sheets, sudden and slicing. The world turned slick and blurry. Trees blurred together. The ground beneath him gave way. His foot slid. A patch of moss turned to mud. He stumbled sideways and tumbled, skidding down a steep incline. Branches clawed at his jacket. A rock slammed into his hip, another tore across his shin. He tried to scream, but wind filled his mouth. Then came the drop. He crashed hard on his right side. Everything went quiet. No pain at first, just silence. Then darkness. The forest around him was unmoved. The trees stood tall and solemn, their needles catching rain. Thunder continued in the distance, pacing like a restless beast. Ethan lay in a hollow, where water pooled slowly beside him. His fingers curled loosely in pine needles. His breath came shallow. A bruise bloomed on his temple. His left leg was twisted oddly beneath him. His backpack had torn open, spilling a granola bar and a toy compass into the dirt. Miles away, Sarah screamed his name until her voice cracked. Mike dialed the authorities, voice trembling. But search and rescue would take time. Roads were already flooding. Back in the woods, the rain softened slightly. A shift in the trees, a soundless presence. Then movement, massive, deliberate, and watchful. From the shadows, a pair of golden brown eyes emerged. Then another. Then three. 5 shapes in total, broad-shouldered and breathing deep. The rain slid down their thick fur, steam rising from their warm bodies in the cold air. The largest one, a female grizzly with silvered fur around her muzzle, took a step forward. She paused just short of Ethan's body. Her nose twitched. She did not growl. She lay down beside him. The others circled, not touching, just watching. Breathing, waiting. Ethan, still and small, had unknowingly found the most unexpected guardians the forest could offer. And in the hush between thunder and heartbeat, the storm over the canyon had brought the wild and the fragile together in a way no one could have predicted. The forest at night was not truly silent. It breathed. The wind hissed softly through the pine needles, and the trees creaked as if they were remembering something. Under the thick canopy, moonlight barely reached the forest floor, where shadows curled around roots and rocks like sleeping cats. Somewhere within that stillness, 10-year-old Ethan Riley remained unconscious, his small frame curled awkwardly on the damp forest bed. The rain had slowed to a whisper. Fog crept low along the forest floor, curling over the rocks and roots as though reluctant to let go of the ground. Around Ethan, 5 massive shapes kept still. They were grizzlies, 1 adult female, and 4 younger bears, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, their coats thick and dark with rain, their breath steaming in the cool air. They had no interest in harming the boy. In fact, they behaved in a way no wildlife biologist could explain. They formed a semicircle around him, as if drawn not by hunger, but something older, something instinctive. The mother bear was easily distinguished by the silvering fur around her face and the old scars running down her left flank. Her eyes were amber deep and aware, and her breaths were slow, heavy with thought. She shifted once, placing her bulk between Ethan and the open forest, and then settled again, massive head low to the ground. One of the cubs, smaller and leaner, sat a few feet from Ethan's head nose, twitching every time the boy shifted in his sleep. The others lounged silently in the mist. Miles away, beyond the north boundary of the Gallatin Preserve, Grace Anderson stood beneath a tarp, reviewing data from a field laptop. The screen flickered from moisture, but she didn't seem to notice. She was 32, sharp-jawed and sharp-eyed, her skin sun-kissed and lined with faint creases from years in the field. Her hair, a dark auburn, was tied back in a practical braid. She wore a brown field jacket and hiking pants splattered with mud. Tall and thin, she moved like someone who always knew where her next step would land. Grace wasn't the type to keep a pet or a boyfriend. She had once described herself as professionally monogamous to the wilderness. She had arrived in Montana 2 months ago to study bear migratory behavior and social grouping, particularly among maternal grizzlies. Years of research had made her cynical of anything that couldn't be tagged or charted, but something tonight unsettled her. She stood outside her small observation hut on the eastern ridge near Trail 17, where she had set up motion-sensitive trail cameras. Tonight, something odd had appeared. At 5:21 p.m., one of the cameras captured not 1, but 5 grizzlies traveling together, a large female and 4 juveniles. That wasn't unusual. What followed was. At 5:26 p.m., the bears stopped, all 5. Then they turned as if listening. Seconds later, they moved again, but in a loose formation, slow and deliberate with the adult bear in front. The next image, time-stamped 5:41 p.m., showed the bears standing still facing west toward the deeper forest, toward the area where search and rescue teams had been deployed that morning after a child went missing. Grace's brow furrowed. Bears don't coordinate that way unless they're hunting or threatened. This looked like neither. She squinted at the grainy image. Something in the posture of the lead bear unnerved her. It wasn't alert. It was watchful. She packed up quickly, wrapping her laptop in plastic and slinging her gear onto her back. The forest was slick and dark, but she moved with confidence, her boots finding familiar ground. She didn't head toward camp. She headed west toward the coordinates from the last image. Something she thought was happening, something off script. Back in the heart of the woods, Ethan stirred. A low moan slipped from his throat and his eyelids fluttered. The pain in his shoulder had crept down to his back, and his left leg throbbed with every twitch. He blinked into the dark shape swimming through his vision. The smell of wet fur and pine sap filled his nose. When he finally focused, his breath caught in his throat. A bear, right in front of him. He froze. His eyes darted to the side. Another, and another. Panic surged, but his body refused to move. The grizzlies made no sound, no lunge. The largest among them met his gaze, calmly blinked once, and looked away. The smallest bear, closer to his feet, tilted its head and gave a soft huff, not threatening, almost curious. Ethan's breath trembled in and out. He didn't understand. These were the monsters from campfire stories, from school presentations, from warning signs stapled to trees. And yet, none of them moved. They were watching, waiting. Minutes passed. A breeze rustled the branches above. Then suddenly the largest bear stood. The sound made Ethan flinch, but she only turned her head toward the trees. Something or someone was approaching. Grace broke through the brush at a crouch, flashlight low to the ground. She paused as her boot caught a fallen branch. The hair on her arms rose before her brain even caught up to what she was seeing. 5 bears, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, and one enormous grizzly standing dead center facing her, with a stare that drilled past skin and logic. And at their feet, a boy. She dropped the light, not from fear but disbelief. The boy's clothes were torn, his face pale. He looked up at her with the kind of raw, wordless hope that only children carry in the face of terror. She raised her hand slowly, trying not to move too much too fast. The bears didn't flinch. The big one, the mother, huffed a low, deliberate sound and sat. They weren't fleeing. They weren't defending. They were guarding. Grace's breath hitched. Her years of training screamed at her to back away, call for assistance alert, wildlife control. But something deeper, something older kept her still. She stepped to the edge of the clearing and knelt, not entering, not challenging, just witnessing. She met the boy's eyes. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're not alone." The forest was still. The rain stopped completely. The bears made no sound. Ethan looked at the woman crouched on the edge of the clearing. She was a stranger, but she didn't feel dangerous. He nodded once, just enough. Grace stayed like that, watching the guardians of the canyon, unsure who had saved whom. Dawn came slowly to the Gallatin forest, filtered through a dense web of mist and pine. The rain had passed in the night, leaving behind a strange calm, no bird song yet, only the sound of water dripping steadily from high branches to the forest floor. In a small hollow, ringed by giant spruce trees, Ethan Riley lay curled on his side beneath a soaked emergency blanket Grace had tucked around him. His eyes were open now, flicking between shapes that barely moved. The bears had not left. He counted them again, 4 younger bears resting in an uneven arc, and the mother always alert, always closest to him. She had not closed her eyes all night. Ethan hadn't either, though his body screamed for sleep. He was too cold to cry, too confused to panic. All he could do was watch and breathe and not make a sound. Grace Anderson, kneeling nearby, hadn't dared to step fully into the clearing. She had crouched beneath a leaning pine for hours, alternating between watching Ethan and watching the bears. At some point, she stopped trying to understand and simply allowed the moment to exist. Her scientific brain clashed with everything she was seeing. This behavior was not only undocumented, it was antithetical to everything she had learned. Grizzlies didn't guard humans. They didn't encircle injured prey without acting. They didn't stand down in the face of strangers. When the sun finally began to pierce the fog, the mother bear stood, not suddenly, not threateningly, but deliberately. She sniffed the air, turned her broad head toward the east, and with a rumble so low it sounded like a growl from the earth itself, she began to move. The juveniles followed, loping through the brush without looking back. In seconds, they were gone. Only the bent grasses and a faint musty scent remained. Grace rushed forward. Ethan flinched, his body tensing like a stretched wire. "Are they gone?" he whispered. Grace knelt beside him, nodding. Yes. You're okay now. I didn't move, he said. They didn't hurt me. She smiled softly, brushing rain from his forehead. I saw. She helped him sit up slowly, examining the bruises and the shallow cut above his eyebrow. His ankle was swelling badly, but he could move it. Probably a sprain, not a break. Still, he wouldn't be hiking anytime soon. She offered him water and half a protein bar from her pack. He took both with shaking hands. I thought they were going to eat me, he murmured. They didn't. He looked up at her then. Why? She didn't have an answer, but her silence didn't scare him. Once she secured Ethan in a silver thermal wrap. She radioed in her location, Trail 17 Southern Ridge, just above the glade. Rescue was already active in the northern section. They would redirect. Helicopter access would be impossible here. They'd need a med team on foot. ETA 2 hours minimum. While Ethan rested against the base of a tree, Grace wandered a short distance toward where the bears had disappeared. She moved slowly, tracking the indentations in the wet soil, paw prints as large as her forearm. Then she saw it. A birch tree thick and straight, with a swath of bark stripped clean and 3 deep claw marks. They were vertical, too clean for panic, too, even for an accident. She stepped closer. The marks were deliberate, parallel, symmetrical. She reached into her side pocket and pulled out a graphite field pencil and notebook. Drawing quickly, she recorded the exact shape and depth, making annotations about height from the ground just under 5 feet, and directionality of the swipe. Claw marking on birch, she murmured aloud, documenting her thoughts as she worked. Unusual spacing, controlled pressure, may indicate territorial messaging, or something ritualistic. That word ritualistic hung in her throat. Another set of claw marks appeared on a second tree, smaller this time. And then across the clearing, she saw more 3 stones stacked near a patch of moss directly aligned with the clawed bark. Not random, not wildlife behavior she could rationalize. Not anymore. She crouched and traced the stones with her fingertips, then stopped cold. Beneath the smallest stone was a child's sock, muddy-soaked, but clearly human. She didn't tell Ethan about it. Not yet. As she turned to return, a faint rustling caught her ear. She reached for her bear spray instinctively, but nothing emerged, just wind, or the memory of something ancient moving through the woods. Back at the glade, Ethan had dozed off, wrapped in the blanket like a woodland cocoon. She sat beside him and waited. When the rescue team arrived, led by a tall, middle-aged ranger named Curtis Hale, barrel-chested with salt and pepper hair and a voice like gravel, Grace stood up and waved him down. Curtis was known in the region for leading winter survival courses and mentoring young rangers. He was decisive but never impatient, and the moment he saw Ethan, he dropped to his knees without a word. "They found you, buddy," he said gently, checking the boy's vitals while nodding at Grace. "And you found them." Curtis raised his head and looked at Grace. "What happened here?" She hesitated. "It's easier to show you." She led him a few yards away to the claw-marked tree. He stared at it for a long time, running a thick finger over the grooves. "That ain't random." "No," Grace said quietly. "It isn't." Curtis stepped back. "We'll need to get him out first. Then we talk." The team moved quickly, constructing a stretcher and stabilizing Ethan's ankle. As they prepared to lift him, he clutched Grace's hand. "They stayed with me," he whispered. "I know," she said, "and I think they meant to." As the group began their careful descent down the slope, Curtis walked beside Grace. "You've been doing this a long time," he said. She nodded. "You ever seen anything like it?" "No," she admitted, "but I think I was meant to." And as they vanished into the forest, the clearing stood silent once again. But the marks on the birch tree remained, as did the sense that something unseen had watched and decided and left a message behind. The sun hung low over the Gallatin Range, casting long golden fingers across the treetops. In the early morning light, the forest shimmered with dew and the memory of rain. Back at the ranger outpost on the eastern ridge, a small team gathered around a map spread across a wide wooden table. The outpost was a rustic structure of timber and stone, built decades ago, its windows fogged with breath and cold coffee steam. The walls were lined with gear radios and bare safety posters, most of which, after the last 48 hours, felt oddly irrelevant. Grace Anderson stood near the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. She wore a fresh field jacket over a worn thermal shirt, her braid now slightly frizzed from the previous night's damp air. She had hardly slept, but adrenaline burned brighter than exhaustion. Her boots were still caked in dried mud. Across from her, Ranger Curtis Hale tapped the map with a thick index finger, trying to maintain order. "Grace," he said in his gravelly baritone, "we've got the boy out. He's safe. Let search and rescue do their job." "No," Grace said firmly, voice low but clear. "We're looking in the wrong place. We pulled him from Trail 17. That's the southern perimeter. But that's not where it began." She pointed to a spot west of the main trail. "There were claw marks here, Curtis. And stacked stones behavior. I can't explain, but I'm telling you, it wasn't just territory. It felt like a message." Curtis exhaled, glancing around the room. The others, a mix of junior rangers and medics, stayed silent. One of them, a short woman with sharp cheekbones and a buzz cut named Lena, tilted her head slightly. "You mean, like language?" Grace nodded. "Or ritual. Maybe even memory." Curtis rubbed his temples. "You're suggesting bears left a message. I'm suggesting we stop pretending we've seen everything nature can do." There was a pause. Then Curtis grunted. "Fine. We shift the radius west. 2 clicks, you take point." Grace nodded once, and the meeting ended. The others filtered out into the cold morning. Grace stayed behind a moment longer, her gaze resting on the map as though reading beyond its inked lines. Her instincts buzzed. Meanwhile, in a quiet medical tent near the base station, Ethan lay swaddled in a sleeping bag propped on one elbow. His ankle was wrapped tightly, his forehead patched with butterfly bandages. A nurse named Carla, a kind-faced woman in her 40s with graying curls and a soft Minnesotan accent, checked his vitals. "You're lucky," she said with a smile. "Another night out there, and you'd be a popsicle." Ethan didn't smile back. He stared at his hands, fidgeting. "They didn't want me to die." Carla blinked. "The bears." He nodded. "Do you remember what happened?" He hesitated, then nodded again. "The big one brought berries. She dropped them next to me. I think she wanted me to eat." "What did they look like, Blue?" "Squishy. Not like store ones. I only ate 2. He paused. They were warm from her breath. Carla didn't know what to say, so she gently adjusted his blanket and whispered, "Get some rest." Ethan didn't rest. He watched the shadows on the tent wall playing over and over the moment when the massive paw had placed the berries gently beside him. She hadn't grunted. She hadn't forced. It had felt like kindness. Since waking, he'd named them all in his head. Mama Bear Twitch, the jumpy cub, Bigfoot the clumsy one, Dot the smallest, with a faint spot above her nose, and Snore, who made the ground vibrate when he slept. It was easier to make them real. Easier to believe they'd chosen not to harm him, not by instinct, but by will. Hours later, Grace returned to the medical tent. She knelt beside Ethan's cot, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You're famous now," she teased. "All the rangers are talking." He smiled faintly. "Did they believe you?" "Not yet." "Then they didn't see it." She chuckled. "No, but I think you and I did." They sat in quiet agreement for a moment before Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Are you going back out there?" "Yes. I need to see where the marks lead." "Tell them thank you," Ethan whispered. Grace nodded. "I will." That afternoon, Grace and a small crew, Lena and a young tracker named Miguel, set out west of Trail 17. Miguel was no older than 25, with olive-skinned kind eyes and a love for field work that outpaced his experience. He had a habit of talking to the forest as they walked, muttering things like, "too quiet," or "birds are listening." Lena, on the other hand, walked silently, her eyes scanning every branch and leaf with military precision. She had grown up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where her grandmother taught her how to read animal signs long before she joined the Rangers. About a mile into their hike, Grace slowed. There she pointed. A tree stood just off the trail, its bark scored with fresh claw marks, 4 lines spaced like the earlier set, only deeper and higher this time. Below it again, 3 stones stacked with impossible precision. "Same formation," Lena said. "And this one's newer," Grace added. Miguel crouched to examine the base. "There's something under the moss." He peeled it back to reveal a small, flattened object, Ethan's missing compass still caked in mud. Grace exhaled. They came back. They stood in silence, the forest pressing in around them. And for a moment, they all felt it, Not fear, not wonder, but something quieter. A knowing. A bond. Back in the tent, Ethan finally fell asleep, clutching the corner of the emergency blanket. In his dreams, the forest didn't frighten him anymore. It breathed with him warm and slow, like a living presence that had chosen not to be wild that night, but to be kind. The forest floor was soft with layers of pine needles and thawing moss, the last remnants of snow melting into the soil. It was late afternoon, and the sun filtered through the trees in narrow shafts, giving the woods a golden, dreamlike haze. Everything was quieter than usual, as if the woods too were waiting. Grace Anderson walked carefully, her boots silent against the damp ground. She had returned to the site from the day before, alone this time, following no coordinates and no directives, just the hum of instinct that had been guiding her ever since the bear's behavior began to defy everything she thought she knew. In her pocket, folded and slightly crumbled, was a handkerchief. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and oats, a scent borrowed from a pack of butter-baked biscuits she'd left open in her field cabin. She carried no camera, no evidence this time, not even a notebook. About 30 feet ahead, just beyond a fallen cedar, she saw him. Ethan Riley sat cross-legged on a bed of moss, his ankles still wrapped in the same bandages the medics had applied, though now slightly frayed at the edges. He looked thinner than she remembered his hoodie, several sizes too big. Sleeves rolled awkwardly. His hair was a mess of curls matted from the humidity. In his hands he held something small and round, a pine cone, the kind that cracked open to reveal seeds. He peeled them apart methodically and popped one in his mouth. Beside him, not 2 feet away, stood one of the cubs. It was the smallest of the group, Grace thought to herself, remembering Ethan's nickname for it. The faint light spot above the cub's nose made her easy to identify. She was stocky and dark-furred, with a stiff, uneven gait, possibly due to a minor leg injury from birth. But despite her awkwardness, she stood steady between Ethan and the forest's edge. Grace didn't move. Her breath caught. The moment hung suspended. From the right, a rustle. Another bear emerged, snore by size alone, and stood just behind Dot, broad-shouldered and calm. His dark eyes watched Grace without blinking. Still, Grace didn't step forward. Then, Ethan looked up. His eyes met hers, and they widened, not in fear, but in recognition. "I told you they were still here," he said quietly, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't yet had. "I believe you," Grace replied just as softly. At that, Dot stepped forward just one slow pace, her posture shifting slightly. Grace read the message instantly, not a challenge, but a barrier. A warning, yes, but also a gesture of protection. The cub was placing herself between Grace and the boy. A sentinel. Grace slowly reached into her pocket and withdrew the handkerchief. "I brought this," she said, speaking more to the forest than to the animals. "It smells like cookies." She crouched low, not threateningly, and laid the cloth down on a flat rock between them. Then she backed away. Not far, just enough to make the message clear. "This is a gift, not bait." Ethan watched, fascinated. The bears remained motionless for a long time. Then Snore lumbered forward with a gentleness that seemed unnatural for something his size. He sniffed the cloth, puffed a quiet breath, then turned to Dot and huffed once, soft approving. Dot stepped forward and sniffed the handkerchief too. Her black nose twitched. She didn't take it, didn't paw it. She simply sat down beside it and blinked at Grace. Grace nodded once in return. That was all. A small moment. But it shifted something. Just as she was about to retreat, a new voice rang out through the trees. Grace, you out here?" It was Miguel, the young tracker with the easy smile and nervous energy. He emerged from the eastern side of the clearing, holding a pair of binoculars and clearly not expecting what he now saw. He froze. His gaze bounced from the bears, to Ethan, to Grace, then back to the bears. "Don't move," Grace whispered slowly, rising. "They're not reacting. Let's keep it that way." Miguel, in his early 20s, with unruly black curls and boots too clean, for someone who claimed field experience, had idolized Grace since her arrival. Now his jaw slackened as he whispered, "Is that—" "Real, yes," she said, her voice nearly lost in the rustling leaves. "Very real." Ethan stood slowly, favoring his left leg. The cubs didn't flinch. "I think they like her," he said to Grace. "I think they like you," Grace replied. Together the three humans backed away, giving the clearing back to the forest. The bears didn't follow. Dot simply sat beside the handkerchief watching. like a guardian at a gate. That night back at the cabin, Grace wrote nothing. She stared at a blank page for nearly an hour. Then she opened a second drawer in her desk and tucked the handkerchief inside, carefully folded. Some moments weren't meant for science. They were meant for remembering. The rain came unannounced, as it often did in Gallatin during the shoulder seasons. One moment, the sky was layered with soft gray, the air thick with pine resin and fading sunlight. The next wind swept down from the ridges with a howl like a wounded animal, and the heavens opened. Rain crashed through the forest with weight and purpose, not a drizzle, but a deluge. In minutes, the mountain soil, already saturated from days of mist and melt, began to give way. Grace Anderson had been sleeping lightly in her field tent near the western bluff buttes beside her sleeping pad, and jacket half-zipped, when she awoke to the first crack of distant thunder. At first she thought it was another rockfall, which wasn't uncommon in these parts, but then the sound of rushing water followed a deep gut-churning roar that didn't belong here. She bolted upright, boots on, before she fully registered why. By the time she unzipped the flap, the ground outside was already pooling. The narrow runoff creek that bordered the trail to the lower canyon had transformed into a churning brown river, sweeping twigs and pine cones into a spiraling torrent. Her breath caught. Something was wrong. At the same time, less than half a mile downhill, Ethan Riley had left the ranger station under special permission. He had been restless, tugging at his bandages, insisting he needed fresh air. He'd begged his mother, Sarah Riley, weary and hollow-eyed from nights of vigilance. After much protest, she had relented. Under two conditions: he would stay on the marked trail and return before dusk. Sarah herself, a tall woman with delicate bone structure and a nurse's instinctive alertness, had never fully recovered from losing her daughter. That loss still followed her like a ghost, making her fearful, reactive, overly protective with Ethan. Yet it was his persistence, that same soft, quiet determination he shared with his late sister, that finally made her nod. Now, drenched and breathless, Ethan stood at the bend of the newly formed river, his ankle still sore but manageable. He hadn't strayed far, just to the spot where he'd last seen the bears. He thought he might leave something behind, a drawing, a goodbye. But instead, he found chaos. The sound of panic caught his attention, first a strangled whimper carried on the wind. He looked downhill and saw her Dot, the small cub with the white spot above her nose, trapped in a pool of swirling water. She had likely tried to cross the shallow creek before it transformed, and now she was wedged between two rocks near the embankment, one paw clinging to a mossy root. Ethan didn't think. He moved. Sliding down the muddy slope, slipping on slick leaves and soaked clay, he grabbed hold of a low-hanging branch and extended it toward the bear. She was terrified, her movements frantic, yet she didn't bite or growl. Her eyes met his wide, with terror and recognition. The same boy, the same cub. "I've got you," Ethan said, though. He knew she couldn't understand. The water rose higher. Then the earth shifted beneath him. A loud crack, a falling tree or a breaking ledge, he couldn't tell. His foot slipped, his leg twisted, and suddenly he was in the water too, the current dragging him downstream like a twig. Above on a ridge, Grace saw movement through the curtain of rain. She had followed her instinct into the woods, drawn by something she couldn't explain. She had seen the water, had heard the scream. Or perhaps it was just wind, but now what she saw sent her into a full sprint. Below her, Ethan was half submerged, one hand clinging to a rock, the other reaching still for the cub. And then she saw it. From the shadows of the forest, massive and deliberate, came the mother bear. The grizzly descended the slope without panic. Her fur was soaked, clinging to her massive frame, and yet her movement was purposeful. She didn't hesitate. She moved between the two bodies in the river, planted her hind legs firmly into the mud, and spread herself wide across the current. Her torso absorbed the brunt of the flood as she reached forward and, using her snout and shoulder, nudged Dot toward the root where Ethan had first stood. Dot scrabbled and clambered up water, cascading off her back, whimpering softly. Then the bear turned to Ethan. Grace gasped as the grizzly shifted, blocking the current once more. With her side pressed into the flow, she pressed her shoulder against Ethan's body, redirecting the river just enough to let him grasp a protruding root. She braced herself as he clung to the edge, coughed violently, then slowly pulled himself free of the current. Grace ran the last stretch, splashing through the water, barely feeling the cold. She slid to her knees and reached for Ethan just as he collapsed onto solid ground. Dot had already retreated into the tree line, her small figure hidden among ferns. The bear mother stood still, She looked at Grace not with fear, not with aggression, but with something far older. Her eyes locked with Grace's, and for a heartbeat time, stopped. Then slowly the bear stepped back, turned, and vanished into the rain. Grace gathered Ethan into her arms. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't let go," Ethan mumbled. "Not of her." "I know." Tears streamed down Grace's face, mixing with rain and sweat. She didn't know why she cried. Relief, awe, something sacred she had no word for. She stroked Ethan's hair and looked toward the forest, where nothing moved anymore. That night, Sarah wrapped Ethan in blankets by the fire back at the ranger station. She held him longer than usual, her thin fingers clutching his like they were made of glass. She didn't ask for details, not yet. But something in her posture changed. She sat straighter, shoulders less tight. The weight of fear for once seemed to lift. In a nearby room, Grace dried her coat beside the heater, staring into nothing. She remembered the way the bear had stood, not just as a protector, but as something else. A bridge. The clouds had lifted. For the first time in days, sunlight cut clean through the trees, landing in golden sheets upon the forest floor. The Gallatin woods, damp and weary from the storm, were once again still not empty, but reverent. A hush lingered in the air, as if the land itself was taking a breath. Ethan Riley stood near the edge of a shallow glade, the same one where he'd once watched the bears sleep. His ankle was healing his movements, slow but determined. He wore a gray hoodie, sleeves pushed up past his elbows, and the same faded cargo pants he'd worn since the incident. A week had passed since the flood, since the mother bear had shielded him and Dot from the rushing waters, and Ethan hadn't spoken much about it, not out of fear, but respect. What had happened felt sacred, and sacred things weren't meant to be shouted. Beside him was his mother Sarah. Her tall figure leaned slightly on one hip, arms crossed, a scarf wrapped loose around her neck. Her expression, once pinched with grief and fatigue, had softened. The storm, both literal and emotional, seemed to have passed through her too. She had lost a child once, and nearly a second. But now, watching Ethan, something inside her began to loosen its grip. Her pale blonde hair caught the sunlight in strands of silver, and she squinted as he stepped forward alone. In his hands, Ethan held a small fabric cap, tan-stitched by hand, worn soft at the brim. It had once belonged to his little sister Ellie, and had since become his token of comfort, always folded neatly into his backpack. Today he wasn't wearing it. Today, he was giving it away. He approached the flat rock in the clearing, the one he'd come to think of as the center stone. It sat at the base of two thick spruce trees, surrounded by a cradle of moss and damp soil. With deliberate hands, he placed the cap atop the rock, smoothing its edges. Then he stepped back, knees brushing ferns, and whispered, "Thank you." Behind him, Sarah said nothing. She understood the ritual, even if she didn't know its meaning. 2 days later, Grace Anderson returned alone. She'd been visiting the ridge regularly since the rescue, often retracing her steps, sometimes with Miguel, or Lena, sometimes without. The rangers had stopped asking questions. They knew something had changed, and even if they didn't understand it, they respected it. Today she carried no gear, just a small notepad in her jacket and a thermos of black coffee gone cold. The trail was drier now, though mud still clung to the lower paths. As she neared the clearing, her boots sank lightly into the moss, and her breath caught as she saw it. The cap was still there. But it wasn't alone. Around it, arranged in an almost perfect circle, were 12 stones, smooth, flat, and deliberately spaced. Some had flecks of quartz. One was black as obsidian. They were small stone a cub could carry in its mouth. One, oddly still, had a patch of dried dirt clinging to its edge, as if it had been recently unearthed. In the center, nestled into the fold of the cap, was a pine needle curved like a ribbon. Grace crouched, heart thrumming. She didn't touch anything. She studied the spacing, the pattern. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't wind. This was intention. She sat cross-legged before the rock and stared for a long time. She thought of Ethan's words, of the bear's calm when they should have been afraid, of Dot sitting between the boy and the world like a guardian, and of the mother bear's eyes full of something that went beyond instinct. There was a rustling in the underbrush behind her, and she turned slowly. Miguel stepped through the brush, holding a notebook. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and he looked sheepish. Didn't mean to sneak up. Grace nodded. "You're fine." He approached quietly, glancing at the rock. His eyes widened. "That wasn't here last time." "No," she said. "It wasn't." Miguel knelt beside her. "You think They did it. Grace didn't answer at first. She touched the edge of the moss with 2 fingers. I think they responded. To the boy, to the gesture. Miguel sat in silence for a while, then spoke. They're not supposed to be like this. No, she replied. But maybe we're not supposed to be so certain. She stood slowly brushing dirt from her knees. Come on, let's give them space. As they walked back through the forest, Miguel glanced back over his shoulder. The circle remained undisturbed like a boundary between 2 worlds. Back at the ranger station, Sarah watched Ethan draw. He was sketching the forest again. No bears, no people. Just trees, streams, and rocks in circles. She didn't interrupt, but when he finished, he turned the page around and showed her. Do you think they remember? He asked. Sarah looked at the drawing, then at her son. I think they don't want you to forget. That evening, Grace took the path down toward the trailhead, one last time, before sunset. She paused near a small birch and pulled a pen from her pocket. On a piece of bark, she wrote 1 word in small, careful script. Witness. She didn't sign it. The wind carried the scent of late summer pine as the Riley family stepped quietly onto the edge of Trail 17. The forest had changed in subtle ways over the past year, some paths now overgrown, some trees taller, some no longer standing. But the heart of the Gallatin wilderness remained the same, ancient and aware, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, and memory clung to bark and soil like dew. Ethan was 11 now, slightly taller, still lean but with a steadier step. His eyes had the same quiet alertness, but there was something deeper in them, an understanding that most boys his age didn't carry. He wore a green fleece hoodie and a pair of scuffed hiking boots too large for his feet, a hand-me-down from his dad. In his arms, he carried a small woven pouch tied with a string of red yarn. Behind him, Sarah Riley adjusted the carrier on her chest, where baby Claire slept peacefully bundled in soft layers of cotton and wool. Sarah's face had softened over the past year, her movements less rigid, her smile easier. Grief no longer defined her features. It had simply become part of her like a scar that faded with time. She was still tall, still elegant in her quiet strength, but now she moved with a rhythm that suggested healing had begun to outrun the pain. Mike Riley followed just behind, carrying a blanket and a collapsible stool. He was broader than before, his beard thicker, but his eyes still lit up when Ethan glanced back. He was the steady base, the quiet support, never asking for details about what had happened that week last year, but never once doubting its truth. Grace Anderson had joined them for the hike at Ethan's insistence. She now worked as a wildlife consultant and part-time lecturer at the University of Montana, though she still returned to Gallatin regularly. Her presence today was less scientific and more symbolic. She wore the same worn boots, though her new parka was a dark burnt orange, and her once single braid had been replaced by a loose ponytail streaked with gray. Miguel trailed behind holding a thermos and a camera he hadn't yet used. He had grown more confident over the year, his tracking skills sharper, his footsteps quieter. But he too understood that this wasn't a day for evidence. It was a day for presence. They arrived at the clearing just after noon. The sun poured through the breaks in the trees like liquid gold dappling the moss with patches of warmth. The flat rock Ethan's stone sat where it always had, solid and unmoved, though time had weathered its edges further. Ethan stepped forward alone. He crouched slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the rock as if greeting an old friend. He reached into the woven pouch and pulled out its contents, a folded paper drawing worn and faded, showing a crude sketch of 5 bears, a mother, 4 cubs, and a boy in the middle. He placed it gently on the stone, then set a pine cone beside it. Lastly, from his pocket, he took a single polished river stone, smooth and egg-shaped. He rolled it across the rock and let it rest beside the pine cone. "Hi," he whispered. The forest responded only with breeze. He stood and took a step back. Sarah stepped forward, holding Claire now in her arms, the baby wide-eyed and calm. She kissed Ethan's forehead and joined him in silence. Grace and Miguel stood farther back, watching with the reverence of museum-goers in a hall of ancient relics. Then Ethan saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, just to the left of the stone, a large leaf had been placed, an oak leaf brittle and brown, from last autumn curved slightly as if recently disturbed. It sat atop a small depression, in the moss perfectly centered. He walked over carefully and crouched. No footprints, not even paw impressions in the mud. but something about the leaf felt intentional. It wasn't blown there, it had been placed. Mom, Ethan called quietly. Sarah stepped beside him. She looked down at the leaf, then at her son. Do you think she started, but stopped herself? They still remember, Ethan said. His voice wasn't full of wonder. It was calm, certain. Grace stepped forward, next crouching beside him. There's a story told by the Crow tribe, she said softly, about a bear that chose not to attack a boy lost in the woods, but instead taught him how to survive. When the boy grew up, he returned every year to leave gifts for the bear. The tribe believed the bear remembered the boy's scent long after the boy forgot his own fear. Did the bear ever come back? Ethan asked. No, Grace said, but it always left something behind. They stood together in silence. Claire gurgled softly, kicking her foot beneath her blanket. Mike chuckled and kissed her forehead. Ethan turned to Grace. Do you think I'll see them again? I don't know, she replied, but I think they saw you, and that doesn't go away. As they packed up to leave, Ethan paused one last time, staring at the stone, the leaf, and the space in between. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, he just nodded. When they began the walk back, the woods felt different, not because of what was seen, but because of what was acknowledged. The forest didn't owe them anything, but somehow it had chosen to answer. Sometimes the greatest miracles come, not with thunder or light, but in silence, in the warmth of fur instead of fire, in the quiet choice of protection over instinct. Perhaps it wasn't just nature that stood with that boy in the flood. Maybe it was something higher, a gentle reminder that even in the wildest moments we are never truly alone. In our everyday lives, we often rush past the quiet signs, small acts of grace, unseen kindness, unexpected help. But maybe those are the very moments where God's hand moves. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel for more true stories of faith and wonder, and type Amen if you believe God still works in mysterious ways. May God bless and protect everyone watching today.